Good morning. Today is the first day of Tevet, Rosh Chodesh Tevet, and it's also the 13th of December. We're in the 6th day of Chanukah, 2 more days. And in today's reading in Parashat Mikeitz, there's the big meeting between Joseph and his brothers. And one of the things that strikes us immediately is, why does Joseph do what he does in not revealing himself and not telling them who he is? It would seem that it's almost, how shall we call it? It's almost like a tragedy. It just continues on. And even if Joseph wants to teach them something, a lesson, whatever it is, it seems cruel. It seems that something's wrong with the whole situation. And to a certain degree, it's not surprising that afterwards, at the end of the book of Genesis, Joseph's brothers are afraid that he's going to now take revenge on them after Jacob has passed on, because it's very hard to understand why in the world he wouldn't just reveal that he's Joseph. The way that Hasidic thinking tackles this very real question is by looking at the following verse. It says, Joseph recognized his brothers, but they did not recognize him. So we take it as just being recognition. Recognition in the sense that, should we say it, that you know who they are. It's like they showed you their passport. Now you know who they are. But the word recognition is different than the word to know someone. To know is ladat, recognition, le'akir, is a completely different proposition. And usually when we say le'akir, we mean to know someone who is foreign. In fact, the word hakara, of this type of recognition, is also used in the word for foreigner, nochri. What is going on here? To bring them to this point, obviously there had to be a very deep or inability to accept one another. The brothers were not able to accept Joseph. Joseph was not able to accept his brothers. So when the Torah says that Joseph recognized them, what it means to say is that he came to terms with their differences. He was able to accept that there were differences. And what are the differences? So we've mentioned this already, and it's very clear from the dreams that Joseph had in the beginning, that Joseph is meant for something different than his brothers. His brothers are going to be shepherds, and that's okay by them. They don't want anything more. They want to continue Jacob's traditions, to some extent at least. They're interested in living a quiet life. In a certain sense, they're not Abrahamic material, you would say. Meaning, they're not going to do what Abraham did. They don't have the ability to do that. They don't know how to connect with other people, other languages, to spread belief in one God. Apparently each one did it, when he had the chance to, but this was not their main occupation. And they wanted to lead a quiet life of being shepherds. Joseph, on the other hand, wants to be a king, and he wants to be something great. He doesn't know how great, but he knows he's cut from a different cloth. And so ending up in Egypt is actually very good for Joseph, and we see that he thrives and he flourishes. He first flourished in the house of Potiphar, and even when he was thrown into jail, he thrived and flourished there. And when he was taken out of jail, he finds the language to become the viceroy of Egypt. He's a very talented man who has abilities that his brothers simply do not. So the hatred was because really the brothers saw Joseph as another version of Esau. In the same way that Esau was someone who was, and we talked about this, why Isaac wanted to bless him, because he felt that Esau had the energy, the potential, the power to change the world very quickly. The brothers saw Joseph as another version of this, and they were not very happy with it. And they thought that just as Abraham had one child who left his way, Ishmael, and just as Isaac had a child who left his tradition, Esau, so now Jacob also has one child who is going to leave the tradition, and he can't be counted on. And so really what they wanted to do was to get rid of him as fast as they could. But now, 12 years later, so Joseph looks at them and he says, wait a minute. Sorry, it's more than 12 years. It's been actually 22 years later. Joseph looks at them and says, I understand your role. I'm not angry at you anymore. But for this hatred to end, for this strife that has afflicted our family for 22 years to end, there's only one way. You have to come to recognize me and my abilities and what I stand for. And so the whole elaborate production now is not simply to see whether he could have revealed himself in one moment and everything would have been over. But as we wrote in the article, maybe I'll read this one section because I think it's a very powerful statement. At first, Joseph could not reveal his identity. Doing so would have added nothing to the decades-old feud. Knowing who was still alive would not have changed their assessment of him and their resentment of him. After the initial relief of finding him again, the fact that it was indeed Joseph would have been a superficial piece of information that would not break the wall of alienation that the brothers felt towards Joseph. Joseph realized that before his brothers became aware of his identity, they would have to appreciate his true worth. And then, if they could see what he had accomplished, who he was, what he was doing in Egypt, when they could learn about how his house was being conducted, that was a very important piece by him. That whole thing of later that he's going to put their money back into their sacks, and he's going to force them to come eat by him. He's going to force them to see how he conducts himself in Egypt. And, that was a complete shock to them. That suddenly here in the midst of the greatest empire in the world at the time, and the place that was most idolatrous at the time, in the middle of this, the viceroy of Egypt is someone who runs a Jewish home. And it was something that was a complete shock to them. But they began to understand slowly that, wait a minute, this is, when they finally understand that this is Joseph, it all comes together. They understand that what Joseph has done is he's brought Abraham and Isaac and Jacob's belief, their belief system, into the heart of Egypt. And not only that, he used that belief system, and I said we would talk about this on Friday, he used that belief system in order to save Egypt and the rest of the world. He used those teachings that he had received in his home to find a way to stave off the starvation. And there was no question that it was being done because of this. Not only that, they would have learned by now that Joseph had literally forced every single Egyptian to circumcise. Imagine something like that today. It's almost, certainly today you couldn't force people, but imagine someone who could come in and he didn't force them, he didn't take them by force. He said, if you want to receive from the food, you have to be circumcised. And we'll talk about that on Friday again, because it all has to do with the same idea that he had, a brilliant idea, about how to make sure that the food is preserved. But imagine something like that today, that someone could convince everyone in Europe, for instance, to take on kosher for some reason. Not that they have to, but he would convince them that this is the best thing in the world. And some traveler would now come to Europe and say, who was this man? And how did he do this? How did he convince you that this is the most important thing? He would convince them to do things that on the face of them don't belong there at all. And so they get to know Egypt. His whole idea is to immerse them within Egyptian culture, to see that he is really Joseph. Remember, they don't recognize him physically. Imagine somebody coming after so many years, 22 years, and saying, I'm Joseph. They have no way of verifying it, really. In fact, the fact that he was circumcised also didn't help, because everybody was circumcised now in Egypt. But really, they had no way to verify it. The only way they could really come to terms with everything that had happened was to go through this process of understanding what Joseph had achieved, of understanding how he ran his household in Egypt. That would change their recognition of Joseph as being different than them, being able to do things that they can't. And so he's not another version of Esau. He's not Esau going out into the world and forgetting about all the traditions that he has from his father and from his grandfather. He's a completely different phenomenon that they haven't seen yet in the Abraham families. A man who has the ability to become a leader of the greatest empire, yet remain completely committed to all the traditions of his forefathers, and beyond that, and even beyond that, he's actually carrying the Abrahamic tradition into new places where it's never been before. It's not just that he's able to stand the tide of the wave around him. He's actually able to change the ocean around him. And that is something that needed to happen for them to be able to recognize him. To truly recognize him is to understand his place in the world, to understand that it's not the same as they are. And then, when he will reveal himself to them, eventually in next week, they will be able to accept that the feud is over. We understand what your place is. We understand that you have this place. Still, like I mentioned, they were still afraid that he would take revenge on them for what they had done. They didn't realize yet that he recognized them, that he knew that they also had their place, and he showed that they had their place when they end up coming down to Goshen in next week's Parsha. He gives them the land where they can continue to be shepherds. He doesn't tell them, come with me into the palace and let's take over the world together. He knows it's not for them. This is not their calling. They have something else that they need to do. So thanks very much for joining today. Hope to see you also tomorrow without the coughing.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah, sure.